Hello. Our guest today is Michael Hyatt, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Thomas Nelson, the largest Christian publishing company in the world.
That's right.
Mike?
That's correct.
Welcome to Lipscomb.
Thanks, Tony.
It's a delight to have you today. Mike, I hardly know where to start. I've studied a little bit about your background and your life. You're an amazing guy. I mean, if there's anybody that I think I've ever run across who is truly a Renaissance man, it would probably be Mike Hyatt. So there's so much I want to talk about today. But let's start with your day job. Let's start with Thomas Nelson. Tell me just a little bit about Thomas Nelson. When we say it's the largest Christian publishing company in the world, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, our company actually started in 1798, so we're the oldest commercial publisher still in existence. We're the largest Christian publisher, and we're the 7th largest trade book publisher in the U.S. So we have a business that's broken into 2 segments. About 80% of it is our publishing business, and about 20% of it is a live events business where we put on conferences, primarily for women, all over the country. This year we'll have about 300,000 women go through our conferences.
Really? Now, Mike, we're all reading a lot about the future of books. Many of us have bought iPhones and iPads and Kindles and all that sort of thing. So you must be thinking a lot about the future of books. Tell me what you think the future of books is.
Well, I'm not sure about the future of books, but the future of reading I'm pretty confident of. I think people are reading now more than they ever have, and I think because of new technologies that are coming on stream and will come on stream this year, I think reading will go to a whole other level. So I'm very optimistic. I think digital publishing is going to make books available to people that really couldn't get to them before. We have a pretty vigorous foreign licensing effort, for example, to get our print books into other parts of the world. But that really is limited by geography and by the communications technology and by all those things. But with the computer and the internet, it's going to make it possible for people to download our books in places where we could never have a physical presence.
So do you have your books available today on
Yes.
Apple and through the other book sources?
Yeah, it was a big transition because like a lot of publishers, all we published was print versions of our books. I mean, that's a technology that has served the world very well for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. So we had to go back and digitize a lot of what we call our backlist, or the books that are in our archive. But today we have about 3,500 books available for Kindle, almost the same amount for the Barnes & Noble Nook, and about half that amount available on the Apple platform. But every book that comes off our publishing line today is available simultaneously as a print book and in one of the 6 major ebook formats.
We've heard a lot, Mike, about being able to do very creative things with ebooks that can't be done with the static, typical printed page. In our business and education, we're looking at developments in textbooks where pictures now come alive and become videos and things like that. Are you working on those kinds of ideas?
You know, we are, but I think that we're realizing that that's not the kind of panacea that people have thought. I think it works great for reference books, for textbooks, for children's books even. But I think when you're, for example, wanting to read a novel or wanting to read a standard nonfiction book, that stuff is fine at the end of the book, but it can become very intrusive on the reader's experience if it's in the middle of the book. So we're doing what we're calling enhanced books, where we'll include some of that content at the end, but and in the reference area, some of it even in the middle or even in the Bible. We're the largest publisher of Bibles in the world. But I think for the standard nonfiction and fiction books, I don't think you're going to see a lot of that. It's difficult to compete with the reader's imagination and very expensive to produce.
I'm interested, Mike, in your perspective on the Christian world. You're in a very unique position. You're in a for-profit business, but it's a Christian for-profit business, and certainly as a Christian university here, we're very interested in the world of Christians and Christianity in this country. Tell me what you see when you look at America and look at the Christians in America.
Well, I think we're in a real transitional time right now. We've got so many people that identify themselves as Christians or having a spiritual inclination, and yet attendance is falling off at a lot of churches. And I know I've got 5 kids myself, and for some of them, it's difficult. I mean, they would consider themselves Christians, but it's difficult to get them to church. And so they don't identify with the institution as much. the way that's working itself out in our business is that a lot of the younger generation doesn't want to shop in Christian bookstores, for example. They want to find the Christian books they read alongside the other books they read in a general market bookstore. They really don't want the kind of segregated or segmented life that I grew up with, where you would go to the Christian bookstore and you'd buy everything. So it's much more organic and comprehensive than that.
Now, when you travel around the country and speak at churches, which I think you do,
I do,
a good
yep.
bit of, we've seen a transition from the traditional denominational structures, the Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Churches of Christ, and now we have a rapidly growing structure of community churches and churches that aren't branded or labeled. What's your perspective on that movement?
Well, it's certainly the fastest growing movement out there, and that's where there is a lot of vitality, but it's also kind of the Wild West, because there aren't any denominational controls or really any kind of structure to that you can project across all those different churches. But the interesting thing is that kind of in the place of denominations, you've got networks or associations of churches that are starting that really function in many ways like a denomination, but are probably a little more efficient and have less of a bureaucracy to it. I think it's all good. I think to the extent that propagates the gospel and gets the message out there to people in a way that they're comfortable with, great. I'm very concerned about, I don't want the message tampered with. I want the basic message to be the same. But in terms of the delivery mechanism, I'm wide open to that.
Let me go back to your comments about your kids not attending church in the traditional sense, and I'm sure that they do, but perhaps not as dogmatically as you and I grew up doing.
2 or 3 times a week. Right.
Sure, that's exactly right. But I'm interested in the alternative delivery methods. I'm going to ask you in a few minutes about social media and other things that I know you're very interested in. But before we talk about that, let's talk about alternative delivery methods of worship services and things like that. Could you see us get to a point where worship is a shared experience, but it's done electronically without physical presence?
I definitely think we could get there. I don't think it would be a good thing. And here's why, is I think the fundamental message of the gospel and of the Christian faith is that God became man, that there's an incarnational aspect of that he put on real flesh, and he came to us where we are in our lives. And I think that authentic community can be aided and can be built or facilitated with social media, but it can't become a replacement for that. And so my closest friends in life are all on social media, and we see one another more than ever. But it's augmented by social media, but social media hasn't replaced that. And my fear is that if we got to the point where we think that it could, that it would become a kind of faux community that really would not have the same validity or the same depth and richness of experience that a real community has.
Let me go back to Thomas Nelson as a business for just one more second. We are a college of business, and so we're really interested in the business side of everything. Your company was a public company until
2006, right?
Okay, a couple of years ago then, and you elected to bring in a very large private equity owner partner, and I wonder what your observations are for other chief executives who may be watching this, considering the same thing. Tell me the pluses and the minuses to formerly being a public company and now having a very large private equity partner as your primary shareholder.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I think that probably no matter how you're funded or whatever the capital structure is, there's pluses and minuses. As a public company, you've got all the reporting requirements and all the care that you have to exercise in terms of what you communicate to the market and when you communicate to the market. And I remember when I started blogging, my attorneys were very concerned about that when we were a public company, because they said, well, there's this law of selective disclosure, and you could be in real trouble. And I said, but this is a public media, so if I'm blogging about it, I'm making it public, and I don't think I'm going to do anything stupid. And honestly, we've never had a lick of problem with that. But I think that private equity is great because you're out of the public sphere. You don't have information go into your competitors like you did when we were public. We were the only public company in our space. And so all of our competitors had visibility into our numbers. We had visibility into none of their numbers. So it did kind of put us at a competitive disadvantage. I would say the limitations of private equity are that you've got very few or a handful of investors that are very involved. Whereas a public company, you've got it spread out, and if people don't like what you're doing, they just sell your stock and they move on. So there's pluses and minuses.
Okay. Our guest is Michael Hyatt, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Thomas Nelson, the world's largest Christian publishing company. Now, Michael, you have an entire other career. You have michaelhyatt.com. You're a blogger. You're a speaker. You travel around the country. You publicize those activities on your website. I'm very interested in how you've branded yourself. Tell me about your strategy, both personally as well as how it synergistically ties in with Thomas Nelson.
Well, it was kind of accidental. I mean, it's like a lot of things in life. I kind of stumbled into it. I thought I would start blogging back when, before it was even called blogging, as a way to create a repository for my best thinking, and also a way to pass it on to others. I never dreamed that it would be a big thing, either blogging or my site in particular. And I did work with some other names initially. I think at one time I called it From Where I Sit. Another time I called it Working Smart. And I thought, no, it's just me.
Yeah.
It's just me. And I'm the best me I can be, but I'm not. I'm not really a category of anything other than me. So I just kind of fell into it. In terms of synergistically how it fits in with Thomas Nelson, I think Thomas Nelson obviously helps me in terms of visibility on my blog. I think my visibility also feeds back into Thomas Nelson. And it's given me the ability to influence people, people that happen to be our authors, people that are our authors that want to get visibility with other leaders, and that's really the focus of my blog site is leadership. So I think it works very well synergistically.
You give a lot of advice on your blog, or in your blog. You talk about things that are as eclectic as your view on spiritual matters, but you also talk about how to make your office more digital, how to become paperless. Fascinating things, and particularly considering the breadth of that knowledge from those two extremes. Well, what's your strategy and how you choose to talk about in the blog?
Well, I'll tell you, when I first started blogging, Tony, I was really eclectic. I mean, believe it or not, I'm very focused now compared to how it was. But I think that's typical for most bloggers. You have to find your voice. You have to find where your passion intersects the readership, where there's really a lot of readers. And so over time, and I've written about 800 blog posts now, but over time I found that the things that I was really passionate about were leadership, productivity, publishing, and social media. And then I have another category that I call miscellany. That's just everything else that doesn't fit. But as it turns out, there's a tremendous number of people that are interested in leadership. Because I don't care who you are or where you find yourself in life, you're a leader. If you have a desire to influence other people, and that's my definition of leadership, then you could probably use some help with leadership, some coaching, some advice, some ways to do it better. And I'm just a student that's sharing my struggles as I go along.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute, because I'm very interested in leadership myself as a dean. So what have you learned about leadership?
Man, I've learned a ton. It's a lot easier to write about than to actually do it. I mean, there's an enormous number of lessons. I would say that the first and foremost thing that I would say is that you've got to be able to lead yourself. If you can't lead yourself, you don't deserve to lead others. And that's the hardest entity to lead. I have making sure that I do the things that I'm committed to, and being an example in my own life is the most important thing I do as a leader. It's kind of like parenting. You can say whatever you want to your kids, but at the end of the day, what you do and how you live and what your values are, those are caught, not taught. And I think the same thing is true in leadership.
So I assume, Mike, you're talking about integrity. You're always the same person regardless of whether someone's looking or not.
That's right.
You have discipline. You're a disciplined person. If you say you're going to do something, you do it.
Exactly.
Is that what you mean
Yes.
by that term?
Yeah, and I think engaging in those basic disciplines and whatever you're asking other people to do, that you're willing to engage in those yourself. So you're not having inadvertently slipping into two standards where it's kind of one standard for myself and then one for everybody else.
If you looked around at other leaders, who would you pattern yourself after?
It's probably a composite. I mean, the easy answer is Jesus. I just think he's, the greatest leader ever. And so I have done some study in terms of, his leadership style. But I mean, modern guys like John Maxwell's had a huge influence on me as a leader. but other historical figures too. I mean, I love reading biographies. People like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther and all those people in history that led in very difficult circumstances are always an inspiration to me.
When you look for authors, what do you look for?
Great question. I look for somebody that is passionate about their message and has a unique message. I'm looking for somebody, hopefully, particularly in this time when everybody and their brother's got a book, who has a platform. Maybe they've got a blog with a defined audience, or they've got a television show or a radio show or a distinct vertical community that listens to what they have to say. They have social authority. So we're looking for that as well. And somebody, frankly, that sees us as a partner, not a vendor. Somebody that wants to come alongside us and work together to create something that would be valuable to us both.
You must have a lot of great stories about discovering unknown authors and making them into bestsellers. What's your best story?
Oh, man. I have a lot of those stories, and I wish there were a formula that I could articulate where this is what we're always looking for, and it works, but it's not. I'll tell you, one of my best favorite stories is an author by the name of Andy Andrews, who's a New York Times bestselling author today. But he was shopping a manuscript probably about 8 or 9 years ago called The Traveler's Gift. And it was turned down 52 times, including twice by us. And I was speaking at a conference, and his manager, Robert Smith, came up to me and he said, "Mike, I've got this proposal from Andy Andrews, and I just want to know if you'd read it." And I get asked this almost every day,
I bet.
and sometimes many times a day. And I knew Robert. I said, "Robert, look, we've turned that down twice. I mean, don't you take no for an answer?" And he said, "No, I really just want you to take a look at it. And in fact, I've got the whole manuscript." And I said, "Okay, I'll take it home." So I took it home, and I gave it to my wife, which I almost never do. And so she read through the manuscript, and she said, "You've got to publish this." And I said, "No way, we've turned this down twice." And she said, "I'm just telling you, you've got to publish this." And I said, "Well, let me take a look at it." So I read it, and I thought, this is pretty good. I said, "I'm not sure why we turned this down, but long story short, we decided to publish it." And CBS Good Morning picked it up as the first book in their book club because they were trying to compete with Oprah. And the thing went crazy.
No kidding.
And so then he had another book on the New York Times list called The Noticer. And by the way, he's one of the best speakers you could ever possibly hear. I mean, he's phenomenal and has become a dear friend. But that was out of nowhere. And I always tell people that's why you got to be persistent. Another book that we published, The Same Kind of Different as Me, which is a fabulous book. It's on the New York Times list right now, 147th week in a row on the New York Times list. Same thing, rejected over 50 times. The agent begged us to publish it. He said, "You guys have got to do this just as a favor to me. Just take a flyer." And so we did, and it's being made into a movie now, and is a tremendous book.
Now, I think everybody's got a book in them, and some of us don't write as well as
Everybody
others.
thinks they have a book in them.
Everybody thinks
Okay.
they have a book in them. So tell me what advice you would give someone who says, "Mike, I think I've got a book in me. How do I write a book? How do you write a book to make it a marketable book?"
Well, the first thing I would say is don't write a book, write a proposal for a book. And I talk about that on my website at michaelhyatt.com, give specific advice for first-time authors and what they should do. But to invest yourself into a manuscript before you've kind of seen if there's a market for it, with the exception of fiction, but for a nonfiction book, I think is a waste of time. Don't get that invested in it at first. Write a book proposal. And the truth is, I would say that for about 90% of the people that think they have a book in them, they can't even get a proposal done. So it becomes a good filter. If you can get the proposal done, then you might have a book in you, and then you can go shop it. Now, the converse side of that is everybody truly is an expert in everything. And the question is, how can you find what your expertise is and offer it to the world in a way that's commercially viable?
So it's about the content. It's really not about the book itself.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, great point. In the time we've got left, let me come back to social media for just a second because I'm just fascinated by your use of social media. Here we both are guys, perhaps at a little bit of an advanced age, me more than you, but you're tweeting and you're Facebooking and you're LinkedIn and you're doing all kinds of things, and that's just fascinating to me how adept you are and how on top of all that you are. What's your strategy about social media, and what advice would you give other executives about what their social media strategy ought to be?
Well, a couple things, Tony. I would say that I approached Twitter, and that's really where I got my start, other than blogging. Like everybody else, I thought it was the stupidest thing I ever heard of. And now you can hardly listen to a radio show or a television show without them giving you their Twitter handle at the same time. So I think if you're a leader, and if you define leadership as influencing others, Twitter represents an enormous amount of leverage to your leadership because it allows you to influence people that you would never meet in real life. It makes people that would never have access to a TV show or a radio show able to broadcast, and even more importantly, enter into a conversation with people that are in their core market. And I think for CEOs in particular, if your job is to raise the visibility of your company, if it's to network with customers and to get unfiltered feedback from them, if it's to promote your products, then I think Twitter and Facebook and blogging are tremendous mechanisms for that. The thing that I would say to CEOs and anybody else that wants to get into that, if you can't engage yourself and see it as part of your job, don't do it. Mm-hmm. It can't be an add-on. None of us have time for that. But you also can't do it with a ghost writer because social media, people smell that. It's got to be authentic. It's got to be from your heart. It's got to be you.
I mentioned at the beginning of the interview that you were quite a Renaissance guy. In addition to all of these other things you do professionally, you're also a dad and a husband of many years. I think you have 4 daughters.
Five daughters.
Five daughters. And so I'm very interested in any advice you'd give the rest of us fathers who may be watching, especially of younger children. What have you learned about being a dad?
I think the most important thing any dad can do is love his wife. I think that relationship is so crucial, and I think that, again, your kids are looking to that. And I've seen a lot of people put their kids first to the expense of their marriage. And if I were going to err on one side or the other, it's investing in my wife and her in me. And I think that that's been a huge asset for me. You know, I've been married for almost 33 years now, and happily married. Happily married for at least 27 of those 33. And but that's an enormously important relationship. And I think it's a kind of stability that you give to your kids that unfortunately is becoming less and less commonplace. There's so many kids, so many friends of my kids who have grown up in broken homes and have really been hurt by that. And that, it's not to put a guilt trip on anybody that's gone through that, because I understand and there's grace and all the rest, but it's a great gift. And so to study your spouse and say, how can I love my wife well and be an example, I think is not only an inspirational thing to your kids, but gives them the emotional foundation that they're going to need for life.
Mike, that's a great way to conclude our conversation. I wish we had another hour to talk, because there's so many more things I'd like to ask you. But it's just fascinating, and thank you so much for coming to Lipscomb University.
Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have you here. Our guest today has been Michael Hyatt, who is the Chief Executive of Thomas Nelson, the world's largest Christian publishing company. We hope you'll join us again soon.